Hi, today I'm going to hopefully fix a little clicking noise problem that seems to come from the front right when you accelerate out of a junction with your steering on full lock, either left or right. Hopefully I'll show that. So either the CV joints on the drive shaft or maybe the bearing at the end of the IRD. And there's quite a lot of play and a bit of an oil leak from that oil seal on the end of the IRD, which is what I'm going to do as a job today. Anyhow, change the oil seal, change the bearing. First, let's just see if I can capture that noise. Hopefully you heard that a few times. Let's just try it the other way. Yep, I think that captured it. So the first stages of doing this job are the same as shown on my other video for changing the CV boot. So off with the wheel, off with the hub nut, knock out the tab on the hub nut. To be honest, an impact wrench is quite useful, something like this, for getting off some of those stiff nuts. This top one always seems to be particularly stiff to undo. Same with the bottom one. A bit tricky to remove, and I had to undo the bottom bolt. Just be careful not to strain this brake hose, and tie up the hub so that it doesn't fall down. Stretch that hose too much, and then push down on the hub of it. Let's push it down. Let's just try and tap that out. Just getting a bit stiff. There we go. Right. That is the shaft disconnected. Just about see that. Let's tie this back up again. I've taken the side engine cover off, as you can see. Bottom engine cover, of course. And we should be able to pull out the drive shaft with a bit of levering. Last time it was a bit tricky and I had to dismantle the CV joint. But apparently they're on circlips, so if I get a big enough lever in there. And we have to take the 15mm and 13mm headed bolts off this engine tie bar bracket, mounting bracket. I think I missed a bolt around the back. There's at least one, possibly two. Bolt just where my finger is in there. You have to get an extension bar, and then with a bit of manoeuvring, this bracket comes off somehow. Where's that going to go? Not easy. I think that's only going to come out of the way, and the drive shaft's moved. There we go. Just push that over there. There we go. So that's that bracket removed. And now we've got a bit more space to try and lever this drive shaft off. So you can see the drive shaft bearing. It's got a fair bit of play in it. This is where the oil was leaking from. Hard to see on the video, but that moves quite a bit. What the manual says is there's a special Land Rover tool for clamping around this shaft to give you more leverage, so you can lever between this and the transfer box case. I haven't got that tool. They warn against putting something in here because you might damage the oil seal, but since we're going to change the oil seal and bearing anyhow, I don't think that matters too much. So what we're going to try and do is get some heavy screwdrivers or something and try and lever in here to overcome the pressure of the circlip that's on the shaft that's holding it in place. And for this I'm going to need two hands. Might need to whack it with a bit of a hammer as well. So a few whacks with a hammer on the end of the screwdriver at this sort of angle. Just a couple of taps was enough to move that drive shaft off its circlip, and that one I'll pull out in preparation for that. And the oil is going to come out, and it's starting to come out. Get a bucket underneath, pull the shaft out, let a few dribbles of oil out, and I think we'll undo the drain plug. I guess that's that one there. To fully drain it in a minute, because what we're going to do next is undo all the bolts around the transfer box right hand end, get the end off so that we can change the bearing. So next, with all the bolts taken out all around the periphery of the IRD unit, and just give it a little tap on say this edge, and you can see it starts to separate and you get a bit more oil dripping out. And it's just a matter of continuing that to remove the outer casing. And that's the IRD cover right hand side taken off, and this is the oil seal partially dented that we've got to remove. There's a new one, same size. The bearing that we're going to be putting in there. The old one should tap out. Oil seal will push out onto the outside, and the bearing will push out, tap out onto the inside. Notice it's tapered, so probably it's shimmed. Must look up whether that needs reshimming to set the play, which is a slightly more tricky job. So this is the differential unit that I removed from the IRD. It's easier to pull it out if you dislocate it from the shaft that goes to the other wheel. Just pops through. It actually comes through, yeah, that side. And if you just get a screwdriver in there, and you can lever against the shaft just to overcome any resistance to removing the shaft. Leave the shaft inside the gearbox, and then you can remove the differential units like so. This is the bearing that we want to change. Quite difficult to remove that. So I levered off the cage and the actual roller bearings. Couldn't really get much of a grip around the bearing to use the bearing puller. So a bit of brute force and ignorance. I'm going to cut down with a disc cutter, cut away the bearing. It might damage the surface of the differential a little bit, but I don't think that's going to matter, and it's covered up with the bearing afterwards anyhow. So there's my disc cutter. I'm not going to show you doing that because it's going to be noisy, and I need two hands. Right, so that's the bearing cut through, as you can see, a little bit deeper onto the shaft than what I wanted, and I made a little bit of mark on it, but as I said, I don't think it matters, and it gets covered up with the new bearing. That's the slice that we cut off. Makes it a lot quicker, pretty quick to cut through, and then you can just knock off the bearing because it releases all of the tension on it. So next we'll remove the old oil seal. I might be able to leave it up from this way, not sure. Yep, we can, quite easy. See the edge is quite worn on that, so it definitely needs changing. And then I'm going to clean it up, make sure everything around the differential is kept nice and clean. So when I was doing the cutting, wrapped all those tissues around it to keep any shards out. And then yeah, this outer bearing race needs to be tapped out, and there's convenient little slots there for doing that. Let's just make a slightly softer surface for housing because you don't want to damage that. Just like that. And after a lot of knocking, the outer part of the bearing knocks out. That's that one. And the washer or shim is the part that goes in there. That will also come out as well. You probably find it's a bit damaged from all your knocking. Bits of indent and a little bit bent. So flatten that back out again. If you're going to reuse it, you can always get a new one by whacking on some piece of metal surface. Go around till it's all flat again. Because really, if it's a new bearing, which it is, it's been put in, then all the distances have to be measured and calculated correctly, and presumably the correct size of shim used. Quite a tricky specialist job, which is why it's not in the Haynes manual for doing this sort of thing, because you've got to fit the bearing to check for play in the bearings of the differential with it all assembled. Once you've got the new bearing in with guess at the shim size, then to change the shim you've got to knock out the bearing again, which is a right pain in the arse. So for me, I'm just gonna refit the original shim, hoping that the new bearing is the same size as the old one. A bit of a rash assumption. The only other choice for the DIY is to get a whole new IRD unit, which is a lot more trouble, a lot more expensive. So some people call it a bit botchy, probably I would as well, but without spending loads of money, that's what I've got to do. What other choice have you got? So let's reassemble it and see how it all feels. To knock the new bearing into place, it's useful to use the old bearing as a tapping in guide. So I'm going to cut a little slot in this so it fits into the housing easier, doesn't get stuck in there, and then we can get a big socket or something and bash onto that, which then bashes onto the bearing just on the outer part of the bearing. You should never tap a bearing in, tapping on the inside, because that'll damage the roller bearings. So I'll clean it all up and tap it in. So in the end, I cut the old bearing outer part of it in two, so that it doesn't get stuck inside the casing. Use those as a tapping guide. And the biggest socket I've got, which is about the right size to go on top of this, is a 52mm socket. So I'll put the new bearing in, just the outer housing. So the part number of that is LM603011 or 49. It's actually marked 603011. And check it's all clean inside. Let's get some more tissues. An engineering shop would no doubt use a press to press in the bearing. but I haven't got that, so I'm just going to use the tapping method. So I've cleaned up the old shim, planned it out, taken off any burrs with a grinding wheel, and it's got a little bit out of shape, but that still fits in place and should tap down okay. So make sure this new bearing's nice and clean. A bit of a flat surface, preferably with a piece of wood, just to get it started without damaging the bearing. Place underneath. Now we'll put our old bearing on top. Probably should have waited before cutting it in half, and done that only on the final stages, or actually not at all, because this doesn't actually drop down into the slot, I've just realised, so probably better to keep it whole, because now it's quite difficult keeping it together. Right, that's the new outer bearing half knocked in. Made myself more work for myself by cutting the old bearing into two. Should have left it just as one with a slot in it, so that's what I'd recommend if you do it. But make sure you don't damage the surface of the bearing or the outer lip. That's fine. Make sure there's no gap around the shim. And next job, apart from cleaning up, is to do this knocking on of the inner part of the bearing onto the differential unit. Make sure that's all nicely cleaned up. And again, we'll use the old bearing to tap the new bearing into place, because it's a tight fit and we don't want to tap onto anything to do with the needle roller bearings. So clean up this, position it just over the little piece, and then let's use another largish socket. That will probably do. And just gently, hopefully, tap it on. Slightly more solid. That's better. Just check if that's going on straight. Which I think it is. Hard to get it started. That actually fits better. Tricky business. Keep checking for straightness. It's a 36mm socket. Just a little bit too small because I have to keep moving it from one side to the other. Check for straightness again. All good. It's going on straight now. Not sure which is best. Both about the same, really. Couple of mil to go, so now we're level with the top part of the main differential, so I have to use the old bearing so it slots around it. So it can't see any light underneath it. Everything still moves smoothly, which is good. And now to clean up and reassemble. So make sure you haven't got any shards of metal anywhere around the differential. Wash it in something like petrol if you have. Use an airline, or you can spray can of WD-40 or something. Should be meticulously clean. And then we put the differential back on, clean up the casing, use a bit of white spirit followed by methylated spirit before applying some silicone sealant. I think I'll do it to both sides of the casing, make sure it's attached well onto the metal. Make sure we have no oil leaks. Let's reassemble, see how that goes. Oh, don't forget to put some oil on the bearing as well. And a little bit of oil around the lip of the new oil seal that just pushes straight into place. I think actually we can do it hand tight or hand pushed in. If you've got a socket the right sort of size, try using that as well. That's a little bit on the small side. And just gently, I think, use again the old bearing half just to tap that down till it's flush with the casing. Fine. Right, let's clean up and reassemble. So that's the differential back in position, and to get the circlip on the other drive shaft, remember that one that we tapped out in there, back on again, you have to tap the end of this with a mallet or something. I used this medium-sized mallet. Obviously you've got to be careful you don't get anywhere near the bearing. Just want to get it right on the end. Make sure then the gears are then parallel with each other, and you should be able to see the other drive shaft just poking in. Feel it in there as well, and when you pull it out, the drive shaft moves with it. So it's in position. So as I said before, not too happy about recommending this as a DIY job because of the need to shim it correctly. So we've just reused the existing shim, even though it's a new bearing. So it's a little bit dubious. I suppose if you find it is really tight and once assembled the wheel doesn't actually move, then you could always but paper shims, I suppose, those cut yourself gaskets, multi-purpose. You could cut a gasket around the casing and shim it that way, I suppose, if it was tight. Not much you can do if it's still too much slack in the bearing, so that's why I wouldn't really recommend it. But I don't know, hopefully it's better than the old one, and worth giving it a go rather than spending a lot of money on a new gearbox, or IRD I should say. Alright, that's the cover back on. Quite difficult to get on. You have to take it in from the other side of the subframe through the gap in there, and then with it past this engine tie. Probably would be easier if you took this off. It's just about possible to wiggle it through with it in place, but was a bit of a struggle. But there it is back on, and now we'll put the bolts back on, gradually tighten all the way around so it's nice and even. Hopefully that'll be good. And that is most, if not all, of the bolts in. But a new drive shaft on it. Actually, it's an aftermarket drive shaft. One of the things I like about working on Land Rovers is the parts are nice and cheap. 65 quid that whole drive shaft. That's the old one there. And it seems quite solid. And the big test is, has it removed the play from the bearing at the end of the IRD? And yes, it has. So that doesn't move up and down at all now, which is very good. Hopefully it's not too tight. We'll see if it feels tight by turning the wheel, and indeed it does turn reasonably easily, as easy as you'd expect. Just turn it by hand. So I don't believe there's a too much pressure on the bearing, at least not a huge amount. Time will tell, of course. Hopefully that will fix my knocking noise, fix the slight oil leak I had out of the end there, and has removed all of the play. And so the drive shafts themselves don't have any play in them anymore. The old one had a bit of play at both ends, so for 65 quid it was worth changing, even though I'd only just changed the rubber boot. So all I've got to do now is fill the IRD with oil, and this is the correct oil, I believe, 75W90, a couple of litres. I'll check the actual capacity in the book before I fill it up. I think there's a level plug on the back of the IRD box. Check in a minute. So I didn't show all the struggles of getting the drive shaft on. A lot of heaving and hoeing going on. Basically you have to push down on the suspension in order to get the drive shaft in, and to push it in you just have to tap on the end with a big mallet to push the drive shaft so that it locates and squashes this circle on the end. Don't have to hit it too hard, but that's it. It's fairly straightforward. So now we'll put everything back together again, give it a test drive. And now all the clunker noises from the suspension have gone. If we pull out around the corner, they've all completed to spin. So I've been for a bit of a test drive, and a couple of miles, look underneath the car, check for any oil leaks, of which we have none. And just put my hand on the transfer box, make sure it's not like boiling hot, which is not, it's just sort of tepidly warm. So hopefully that indicates that the bearing is not hugely binding. And then whereas before this thing is very loose, there's a very minimal amount of play. Interestingly, you can still maybe feel a slight movement, which is a good thing because it shows again that it's not binding on the bearing, but can't actually see it moving like you could previously, and it's a very minimal amount, so that's good. And the noise is all gone, no oil leaks, job done. Hopefully that'll have yours. I'm not sure I can recommend going down the same route. It happened to work for me without reshimming it or anything, which would have been a complicated job, and just changing the bearing and the oil seal seemed to fix all my problems, along with of course the drive shaft. Okay, good luck with yours, thanks for watching, bye.